what's the big issue there? The big issue for this kind of on-farm biosecurity is compliance. How can you convince people to do what we know works? That's the biggest challenge. So I've been doing research on this, and recently just got funds from United States to do work in Canada and United States, looking at ways to increase compliance in the entry rooms when people get in.
Welcome, everybody, to today's episode of the Swine Canada podcast. My name is Dan Columbus, and I will be your host for today's episode. And with me today, I have Dr. Jean-Pierre Vaillancourt, who is a professor in the Department of Clinical Sciences in the University of Montreal's Faculty of Veterinary Medicine. So how are you doing today, Jean-Pierre?
Well, doing pretty good. Thank you. How about you?
I'm fantastic. I'm fighting back a little bit of a cold, but I'm hopefully it doesn't interfere too much with the talk today. I would like to thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on. But since some of our audience may not be familiar with you, before we get into the topic of today, I'll just ask you to introduce yourself and give a little bit of to the audience some of your background and journey so far.
Yes, well, I'm a veterinarian. I graduated from the vet school in Montreal. Then I did a master's degree in clinical sciences, and that was swine work, working on porcine fluid pneumonia. That's way back in the 20th century. And then I moved to Minnesota to work with Al Lehman, Gary Dial, Will Marsh, these people on pre-weaning mortality. But my family background is in poultry, and I had an opportunity at the University of Guelph of having a faculty position, but in poultry epidemiology, because I've got epidemiology training. So that's what I did. But since I've been working mainly on biosecurity, it always brings me back to pigs, because it's certainly something very important there. And after Guelph, I went to North Carolina State University. There again, I did poultry work, but it's a big swine state. So I got to work with people there a little bit as well. And now I'm back at the University of Montreal. I was away almost 20 years, but probably finishing my career in Montreal.
It's you've been all over. It's an amazing background, and some big names in there too. I know the Lehman will definitely ring some bells for a lot of people.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I was also almost a year at La UNAM. It's a university, vet school in Mexico. So where I learned some Spanish there, and I've been also spent a year in Toulouse in France, taking advantage. That's what's nice about being a professor. So we get to go around and often have people pay for us. So that's pretty good.
Yeah, it's one of the perks. It makes all the work worthwhile a little bit.
The Nutrition Athena, Shakespeare Mill, Farmhouse, and Nutrition Partners Nutrition Group offer the full range of nutritional product based on extensive research and developments, and a solid team of experts all across Canada. Our objective is to provide cost-effective solutions, innovation, and support to producer from the entire Canadian swine industry.
So, I mean, you mentioned it already, and your history is very much in the biosecurity. And I think that's going to be a topic of interest to our audience, given, just increases in disease outbreaks that we're hearing. And obviously with the threat of African swine fever, that's always kind of in the back of everybody's mind. So I guess we'll move into the topic today, and I'll let you open up with, what biosecurity is, what it means to you, like some of the work you've been doing in that area.
Sure. Well, first of all, one reason I got into this is when I arrived at NC State, they said, if you want to become a full professor, you're going to have to convince us that in your field, if there would be a big issue nationally, you would be shortlisted by the White House. And so I figured, okay, I've got epidemiology training, so we often kind of go in different directions. But I decided to focus on biosecurity. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and it wasn't just not only planes. We also had bioterrorism at that time. So they got an interest in what I was doing. And so that kind of was very useful to me in a way, unfortunately for the events, but got me going working on biosecurity, which is essentially all sorts of measures that you can put in place to minimize the risk of disease transmission between, in our case here, between pigs, either on the farm and also between farms within the same region. So the thing that I've noticed very quickly, and looking into it, I could demonstrate that virtually all the main biosecurity measures that we're trying to put in place in swine, actually you can find them in the Old Testament, in the Bible. It's just there's two major principles for on-farm biosecurity. One is that you need to reduce sources of contamination. And then the second one is you want to bring a distance between any source of contamination, of infection, and your pigs. Well, these two principles, they come from texts that were published, actually written over 2,400 years ago. So we have not invented anything. So why are we still struggling with infectious diseases and trying to figure out how to control them? Well, turns out that it's like losing weight. We know how to lose weight. That doesn't mean we're going to do it. We know how to control diseases pretty much, but often people will get lazy or may not be aware of what needs to be done because there's a lot of traffic on farms, and that leads to diseases. So what's the big issue there? The big issue for this kind of on-farm biosecurity is compliance. How can you convince people to do what we know works? That's the biggest challenge. So I've been doing research on this, and recently just got funds from United States to do work in Canada and United States, looking at ways to increase compliance in the entry rooms when people get in. Do they change boots properly? Do they wash their hands? That kind of stuff. Do they do that systematically? How can we get them to do that? So I've been working with technical people, for example, using sensors so that we can figure out who's coming in, whether they change boots or not, so we can first of all have data to show them to use for training, but also to give them feedback, real-time feedback, an alarm saying, hey, whoa, you haven't changed your boots. You're not using the farm boots, or you have not activated the Purell dispenser. Your hands are not being decontaminated. That kind of stuff. But that's not enough. You try to make it as much human nature proof. Okay, not to say idiot proof, possible. But then, so that it's a people's game. So biosecurity, in that sense, and here I'm not going to talk about, for example, HEPA filters, because that's also important, to sometimes to have some biofilters for the air in pigs in particular. But all that on-farm biosecurity measures, all these that are associated with people activities, they require working on people. So I'm actually working with an industrial psychologist who's got great training in helping companies to get employees to do what they're supposed to do. It's that it's easier to say than to actually get done, and so we're developing. We're using tools that they have validated, and they're available in French and English and Spanish, which is all very useful in North America. Tools to assess people's personality, because we know that your personality is associated with compliance. Like some people will be more likely to comply. The same way if you have kids, you may have a kid that's more likely to get in trouble than the other one. Well, some they like to follow rules, some not. It's a personality thing in part. But then personalities, it's nice to know, but you cannot change a personality, or it's very difficult. But you can work on emotional intelligence. So, what's your self awareness, your self management, your relationship with other workers, with people? All that can be modified, can be worked on, can be improved. It's rare that we can say you can improve somebody's intelligence. But if we talk about emotional intelligence, we can actually work on this, use that in the training so that we can overall improve compliance. So we're looking at two things. We're looking at ways to improve the training, because there's all sorts of training out there. You do a Google on biosecurity videos, you're going to get hundreds of videos. They all have one thing in common. Uh, Nobody's bothered to check if they work, if they have an impact at all. Okay, we are getting set to assess if compliance is good or not, and if whatever we do leads to better compliance. So it's this is a field that is kind of in development. It's more and more on the front burner, I would say. Uh, but it's not easy to get funding for this, because people go and say, okay, well, what's the cost benefit of redoing our training program, or putting sensors so that we can, with antennas or whatever. How much is that going to cost? Is that going to really prevent a disease? The problem, of course, with prevention is that sometimes you don't really know if you're preventing if nothing happens. Maybe maybe you were not at risk,
Yeah.
or maybe you were, and that prevented it. So it takes a lot of time and effort and many farms to eventually get that information. So it's not easy, but we're working on it because of what you mentioned. We're being challenged. As a matter of fact, just about on the world stage, just about every year, there's an emerging or re-emerging important disease in swine or poultry. In humans, it's like 4 or 5 a year. Okay, like COVID, for example, that was a spectacular one. But we had others in the same year. So emerging, re-emerging diseases, this is something that happens all the time. So we need to find ways to adapt measures that work on a given farm, because that's another thing. The principles are the same. Trying to reduce sources of contamination. So we wash, we disinfect, we will blow heat into a vehicle to try to kill all the viruses and bacteria and all that, and then bringing a distance, like with African swine fever. If you would have pigs outside, well, you need a double fence. Yeah, mainly in Europe and places like that. But even in North America, we estimate that we have between 3 to 5 million wild hogs in North America. They're virtually, most of them, of course, are in the United States. But with climate change, we can see that huge herd kind of moving up. They're starting to be quite noticeable out west, and we know we have a few hundreds in Quebec, where I am. And so we need, and people are going with more and more people would be willing to still eat meat, but they want meat that was done with animals that were raised properly for them. And that often includes being raised outside, and the problem with that, of course, is that anything raised outside is more at risk of many things. And so we are looking and often using other countries almost as a lab. Like, for example, for me, my favorite lab is France. It's It's a nice lab to be in. The food, the wine, everything is good, and also they have a mosaic of production. They You go all the way south to and they raise pigs outside. They sometimes will commingle pigs from two or three different farms on the same field. So that's really crazy in a way for us. But there's a lot of people willing to pay more now to get meat produced in what they call a more ethical way. And so we're looking at the way they're trying to handle this and see how could we adapt that for us, for example, in Canada and in the US as well.
Yeah, this idea of compliance is really interesting. And I think you mentioned COVID, and I think that was a very good social experiment on compliance, because I think we saw how drastic it can be, right, with the different personalities and who's willing to comply. I almost don't like that word because it almost sounds like you're just rolling over and doing right, but it is, understanding why you're doing it and why it's important, right? So you mentioned personality, and maybe it might be a little bit preliminary because I know you're just getting into that work. But are there key personality characteristics that kind of that will indicate, and when you mention like the ways of getting people to comply, are there certain things that seem to be maybe a little bit more uh, um, effective when it comes to getting people to either change or to do this?
Yeah, well, we actually did research on that on personalities, and we could show that between two extremes in terms of personality, you would have some people who would be like 12, 13, 14 times more likely to comply compared to others. And there's several traits when it comes to personality, dominance, persuasion, direct approach, being emotional, altruism. There's also stuff like that. We have three traits that have been associated with compliance. One is called responsibility. Another one is complexity, and the third one is action oriented. So there's people that have a tendency to, first of all, they they are very favorable to being offered guidelines and rules. It's natural for them. They like to take responsibility for things. They also like complexity. So it's not discouraging them to look at different actions that might be needed overall to achieve a certain goal. And they are action oriented. They want to get something done. So these types of individuals are much more likely to comply. Now, what we need to do, one thing to keep in mind, even in a university, we talk about pedagogy. Well, pedagogy is learning for children. Okay, we should be talking about andragogy, which is learning for adults, because we're teaching adults. People on farms, unless you're talking about teenage kids working there either part-time or they are the kids from the grower, by and large we're dealing with an adult population. And we need to consider a few things there. First of all, adults need to know why we ask them to do something. You cannot just say, okay, I want you to do this, that's it. You could, but you're not likely to get a lot of compliance. So that's the first thing. They need to know why. They need to feel respected, and you need to consider their own experience. I see it all the time when I give a talk, and the more I'm dealing with growers or technicians or veterinarians who have experience, the more I can tell that whatever I say, they contrast that with their own experience and how they feel about things. And so you cannot train without considering that aspect. You have like somebody who's been in the business 30 years. Uh, they've had, for 30 years, every day, they change footbaths, maybe twice a day. Okay. And then I come in and I say, you know what? That's worthless. Okay. It's worthless, and we know that. We've known that for decades. It's even in documents from the World Animal Health Organization, where they say essentially, I could quote it, saying, well, people would have to stay in a footbath a few minutes for the footbath to be effective. But even if they don't, having a footbath is a good reminder about biosecurity. So we should still promote that. Well, my attitude is like, no. I mean, if it doesn't work, you don't want to do that. But here's the problem. You go and say, I can demonstrate to you that all the disinfectants, all the products that you're using in a foot bath are certainly very good, but virtually none of them have much of an impact over a few seconds. You need 5 to 10 minutes of contact time. Okay. And so, therefore, foot baths, by and large, and we have research that's been done showing that within minutes, sometimes, as soon as you get organic material in there, it's not only not working, it's actually increasing the contamination level of your boots. So the problem that I've been told then is, well, here's the problem. I've been coaching people for 30 years, getting them to do that. If I tell them overnight, well, you know what? Forget about that. I'm going to lose my credibility on everything, right? So, but then you need to come up with an alternative. And that's when I tell them, I said, well, dry chlorine put in a foot bath actually will get you to reduce by almost 2 logs, or over about 90% reduction in contamination. And you just need to change it every other week. How about that? So you can go and say, well, foot baths are still important, but we got a better product now. This way you don't lose your credibility. So it's a lot of stuff like that you need to take into consideration in order not to lose people. And the other thing is, you need to look at the situation on every farm. And if you have several employees, the key is to try to get them to come up with the solutions. Because I've been on farms, sometimes big farms, 3,000 sows, and they have like 7, 8, 9 employees there. And if I come in as an expert, right, and I come in English in particular with my strange accent, they're going to go and say, who the heck is this guy? And he's telling us what to do. He does not even work here. He's not signing my paycheck. They will be polite. They will smile. And by the time you're gone, they're already moving back to their traditional ways. So what you need to do, mainly if you're a technician, you're a veterinarian, you're people advising, well, you need to find ways to get these people. First of all, then the job of a leader then is to say, we have identified these issues. We have this problem about maintaining the integrity of the anteroom. We have this problem about having an easy way to get our hands decontaminated. Then you say, well, do you have anything to propose? And then you get them to find the solutions. If you do that, then it's a little bit more difficult to neglect your own solutions, to neglect what you came up with, you see. So things like that, there's a lot of stuff that we need, and a lot of it, as you can see, has to do with people issues and how you manage people, how you approach them, and how you maintain also what you're doing. Because, for example, we did a study where we looked at visible cameras. We're going to put cameras and have people made aware that we have cameras. We're watching them, right? I've been on a farm in the United States where they put 24 cameras in a 3,200 sow unit. 24 cameras. It doesn't cost a lot of money. These cameras now, you put one in an empty room, it's a few $100s, including the recording system. So it's not a big deal. But there's a reason why reality TV works, is that after a few days or a few weeks, people forget the camera's there. So, for example, that would be one approach that will work for a week or two. After that, you reduce, you have less impact. But then you can say, well, let's keep those cameras and use them for teaching. So we can review and get video clips out of it and show that to the employees and say, okay, what's wrong with this picture? Or the other way around, what is really great about what we just saw? See? Because that's another thing. Incentives. Okay? You want to achieve good compliance, whatever the business. That includes NASA. Okay? That includes, Taylor Swift right now is in the news because she has the means to give big incentives, right? She just gave like a $100,000 bonus to employees. Yeah, we won't see that on swine farms. But there's a lot of incentives you can give people that are not costly and that are positive, because an incentive can be positive or negative. Negative is, if I find you another time doing this, you're fired. That is a negative incentive. And that needs to be clearly stated, right? One thing we've noticed when we investigate disease outbreaks is that virtually almost half the employees, if you ask them, if we could demonstrate that you're actually at the origin of the problem, that it was your lack of action or whatever you did that was at the origin of the infection, what do you think would happen to you? And remarkably, half the employees don't know. They have no idea. I don't think that's normal. They should know exactly what will happen to them if they don't comply. However, they should also have positive incentives if they do comply. So I'll give you an example. In poultry, in turkeys, they can no longer have natural reproduction because the males now they're reaching 50 kilos, and the females are just 15 kilos. So you can imagine it ain't gonna work. So they do artificial insemination. It's really quite a job to work in that environment, to go get the sperm and then inseminate and all this, mainly in July, August when it's warm. So I've seen a crew member, a leader, go and say, okay, guys, this week is hot, it's humid, you may lose your temper. It's easy to be a bit rougher with the animals. I want to see you take care of the animals correctly throughout. I don't want any problem this way and all that. And if you guys do that on Friday, we'll stop working at 3. I'll pay you till 5. I'm buying the beer. Something like that. So it doesn't have to be extremely expensive, but sometimes it's just like, hey, I saw you what you did today, and that's great. That's remarkable. Sometimes just to be told you're doing it right is something really nice. So all these things need to be factored in if we want to improve compliance.
I think it's important you bring up the good fact. A lot of times we focus on the negative outcomes of something if there isn't, and we forget about the positive and giving. I'm guilty of that myself with my students, right? It's very easy to go and point out everything that's wrong in the paper that they wrote and not say, oh yeah, but this part's okay, or good, or congratulations. So I think it's interesting. You also mentioned, basically the two other things that I refer to as the dogma, right? Of the something that you've been doing for 30 years that, well, we've been doing it for so long, you've convinced yourself it works, even though it doesn't. And it's very hard to go up against that. I do that all the time where I tell people creep feeding doesn't do anything, but you're fighting against an industry that thinks that, it does, and we might as well keep doing it just in case, right? And how do you argue that? I like your idea of like, okay, well, what's the alternative then? What is something else, that we can put in place to then potentially have that? So,
and we need to innovate here. And here I'm going to go back to my days with Al Lehman. Al was quite something. He would go on a farm, and he had an ability to he would go and congratulate people for what he would see. He would pinpoint everything that was fine. Yeah, of course, he would say if something was not right, but by and large, by the time he would be done on a farm, the feedback I would get from the employees or the grower was, well, if Al was impressed this time, that's nothing. Wait till next month when he comes back. He had a way like that. And I remember one day, Al got all the graduate students in the room. It was a Friday afternoon. And he said, to us, I'm concerned about you people. And so we were like, okay, what's going on? He's now he was my advisor, but he was also the boss of the Swine group. And so all the students, including those who were not his students, were kind of waiting to see what else he would have to say. And he said, I've noticed one thing is that you guys make no mistake. Not at all. And he said, that's not normal. He said, yeah, if you're doing that, it's because you're not pushing it enough. You're not, you know. So his point, of course, he says, don't burn down the building. But he says, if you you try something original, you try to be innovative, and it doesn't work out, I'll be there with you and for you. I'll back you up. And so, because the idea here is to move forward, to make progress. Another guy who actually started his career when I was a graduate student in Minnesota was Bob Morrison. Okay, I had a very good relationship with Bob, and Bob was somebody who was very close to people, always at the same level of everybody, and he was adding several dimensions to what he was doing. So, for example, he was a vet. Okay, he was technically an epidemiologist, but he also got an MBA because he wanted to be able to argue with growers about or present growers with, okay, you can do this or do that. This is the cost benefit. This is how we could, how this would likely be valuable. In some cases, maybe it's not worth investing that much in this measure. You should focus on another one that will pay better over time. So his goal was not to have the ultimate like production records, but to be very viable to get the best return on investment. So when we talk with growers, I think growers, technicians, they're very quick to figure out if you have any field experience or if you're talking from textbooks. Okay. So when you go on farms, when we try to improve biosecurity or we have a situation, it's important to connect where they are and demonstrate that we know that the field, we know what's required, how much painful it can be if we ask to do this or that. Say, because nothing worse than to give the impression that you're talking about being a professor or being out there in your own ivory tower. If you get that label, then you won't be effective, right? And you don't need to be a professor for that. It could be a technician. It could be anybody else. If they seem to be too abstract, they don't realize that there's a cost for everything. If I'm going to take more time to do something at the in the entry room, well, there's a cost.
Yeah, it's building that reputation and the credibility, right? That comes in so that they're willing to listen to you. It reminds me of in early days in the COVID where they first said, okay, no masking, and then they said masking here, and then they kept changing it, and then everybody just thought, well, like what are you trying to tell us here, right? And it really damaged that reputation. So obviously, it's really important to keep that going.
Yeah, that's certainly one thing. Now, the one thing is, if you're not going in the right direction, I think it's important to be able to adjust. But you need to do a good job at explaining why that's being done. And they didn't do a very good job sometimes, depending on the province. In Quebec, for example, the one thing that made the province having more problems, mainly with places where older people lived, is that they had all the places, retirement homes, were missing employees, and their solution was to have teams moving around to take care of any kind of greater needs in one place or another. I mean, when you're in the swine business, you know that that's the last thing you need to do. You're better off to be short of an employee or two instead of starting to move them around at the rate they were doing. I was a guy from the Wall Street Journal contacted me early on in COVID and I said, well, why you want to talk to me about COVID? He says, I'm writing a paper where the angle is going to be if swine growers would have been in charge, maybe we would have handled this better. And I said, well, yeah, as long as these growers would be systematic in their approach. But yeah, the average swine guy there knows very well that movement of animals, of people, of equipment, that's a risk. And if you absolutely need to do it, you need to do it right. You see, and so of course, the big. And when you look at hospitals, for example, the one thing that's quite obvious when you go to a human hospital is that infectious diseases is not their thing, right? You look at the curriculum in medical schools, and infectious diseases. I mean, there's 1,480 infectious diseases in humans. Okay. But in developed countries like Canada, we don't have the vast majority of these diseases. So it's not a very, doctors are more trained to deal with people with respiratory issues because of allergies or they have diabetes or that kind of stuff. But when it comes to infectious diseases, they're pretty thin there, and they also don't have an understanding. I remember way back again, 20th century. I had a girlfriend who had three cats. Now the problem was I'm allergic to cats. See, and so I consulted with a specialist for him to help me out. And the first thing he says, well, first thing, those cats are out. And I was like, no, you don't get it. I'll be out before the cats. Okay. So this guy told me he was probably brilliant as a, allergist, specialist, allergist specialist, but he was clueless, clueless about human nature. You don't tell somebody who has pets like that, oh, well, if you want me to go back there, mainly when there are solutions, I mean, there are ways, and I found ways. I go back to that aspect of understanding people, knowing people, so that you can approach them properly to get them to work with you, to increase this compliance thing.
Well, God forbid it happens again. Hopefully they come to some vets and some producers to come up with a plan for the next time around.
Well, they already are discussing that. I was at a public health meeting in Quebec, and we were talking about highly pathogenic avian influenza, and I told them before that meeting, I said, you know what, I'm almost as scared of you as I am of the virus, and I'll tell you why. Because if that virus becomes zoonotic, so can not only infect people but get them sick. I understand that it's public health officials that need to be in charge because now it's a human disease problem as well. But I said, you don't know anything about poultry production. And so you're going to make decisions potentially that could cause more harm than doing nothing. So then they invited me to give a talk about that. You see, so at least they're totally open about this. And one thing I recommended is I told them, I said, public health officials for a few months should go and spend half a day, once a month, on a farm. Okay, if you can get a farmer to welcome you, and because I've seen it done in France, where there were guys, including researchers, people who are molecular biologists and all that, and these guys had never been on a farm. Their thing was the genome, and things like that, and they were forced to go on like a swine farm, And I remember talking to one of these guys who said, you know what? At first, we were really mad. We thought we are going to lose half a day. So he said, I figured, okay, I need to be on a swine farm. What am I going to do? So I'm going to pick the place that's the least disturbing. So he said, I got a chair, a book, because I was planning on reading, and got into the post-winning unit, okay? Because it's not full of big sows and all that. Still smell bad, but I could sit there, have my book. But he said, I never read. So I started looking at these piglets and started noticing things about their environment, them, how they play together, how they fight, all stuff. And all of a sudden, I got a bunch of ideas when it came to research and do stuff like that. Well, the same way, if you have a decision maker who doesn't have the field experience, you need to say, you got to go and get it. Doesn't mean you need to spend 6 months shoveling manure, but you need to have that contact. Another problem I saw, like in the United States, I was asked by a company to do an audit of their biosecurity. And that company had like feed mills and stuff like that, and they and even people at the feed mills had to take a shower before getting in and all this. And of course, they were going to go to farms. And as I was questioning, I realized one employee said, we're the only ones taking showers to go on these swine farms because the manager won't take a shower. So I asked the manager, I said, why won't you take a shower? He says, well, I supervise a lot of farms and I know where I've been. And I'm like, okay. And you do see the viruses as well? I mean, you know where you step? What is that? And I've seen that again and again in North Carolina. I've seen it where you would have employees who would learn from management that it's not always necessary to take a shower, and it comes. So the leadership is very important. Everything has to be considered in order to improve the overall biosecurity. Another thing also is to find ways to have like 2 or 3 different steps that if they miss one or miss two, well, the third one may prevent the transmission, so we need to, but that's where, again, you need to look at the employees and say, what would be your best way to achieve this, what we're trying to achieve, that would be the least painful, the least expensive. It does not have to be high tech. I'm talking about sensors and all that, but it could be very low tech stuff that would allow you to actually achieve what you want to achieve in terms of biosecurity, and that's great. That brings me also to another thing: sharing information, data sharing. Look at Bob Morrison. He became kind of famous with his swine health management, data bank. He got people to trust him, to gather data, so that that data could then be made available to others, because data is power. But when it comes to biosecurity or disease control, it's not a power that you want to keep to yourself. When we're talking about big disease, I'm not talking coccidiosis here. I'm talking PRRS. I'm talking African swine fever, diseases like that. We need to share data.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, because you brought it up a couple of times. You mentioned earlier on the outdoor raised pigs and these niche markets that are coming up, right? Because some consumers want that, they want the pig that's raised outdoors and in a better, or what they consider a better environment or something like that. And these also tend to be more of the small scale producers that aren't really part of the bigger industrial process. So the communication with them is a little bit different. Their ideas of biosecurity and that are a little bit different. So how would you recommend having that discussion with them and bringing up this topic and getting more compliance with them? Because like you said, they are the higher risk proportion of the industry, right?
Yeah, well, in Canada, I would tell you there are, in the US as well, there's a few ways you can do that. You mentioned really the big issue, of course, is that you have the big bad swine industry, and then you have these smaller players who feel that they are in a competition, or that they're going to be pushed over, stuff like that. So these guys are not the best people to take any kind of leadership. Leadership can come from two places in particular. One, Ministry of Agriculture of a province. Okay, so if you can have a swine specialist working for the Ministry of Agriculture. Ministry of Agriculture, it's us, right? It's working for the province, somebody to help, to help the community, help the industry. That person is in a better position to interact with these smaller people, farms. Another thing is then to encourage these farms to be organized. They tend to do it now. They know that they're small, but if they can get together, they may have a little bit more leverage or be heard by government officials. So you need to get to know who are the leaders, get the people from the ministry to engage with them. And the last group of individuals would be university professors. Okay. Um, I in Quebec, there's a group of farmers. They're small farmers. They're not. They do swine, poultry. They do all sorts of stuff, and but they're not lined up with the big swine producers or poultry producers and all that. They're not part of their unions or organizations, but they do have one with their 4,000 members. And I was telling them, I said, you know what? I have a bias towards the swine poultry industry. I was born in the poultry industry. I've worked for decades. I studied with swine, and I have a positive outlook there, and a positive bias. That being said, I work at the university. I work for the community. The vast majority of my income doesn't come from tuitions, come from the government, and so you pay your taxes, you are contributing, you have the right to be in business. Okay, you're not illegal. All this means if you want to have access to our resources, you may be in a position to help. Another incentive for us, for example, at the vet school, is that whether it's in Guelph and Saskatoon, Calgary, PEI, and all that, and certainly University of Montreal, Saint-Hyacinthe, is that our students more and more, they want to be able to help these people. They may not be specializing in swine, but as they're doing cattle or dairy, for example, they may be asked to help with a small swine farm. And so they want to get training that will fit for this kind of, and they find it more ethical as well and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's good then we get to get closer to them. We can help them. It provides us with teaching material. So it can be a win-win-win type strategy there. But I'm pretty convinced that having a specialist, in swine specialist, that is appreciated in the community, in your province, and for the ministry, and then having at least one university, doesn't have to be a vet. It has to be somebody who's well respected in the swine community overall. The vets can play a certain role, but quite frankly, between a very good swine specialist who's not a vet and a vet swine specialist, the only difference is the vet can prescribe. Okay, but when we're talking about biosecurity, there's no prescriptions, and so you can have extremely good experience swine professionals who are not veterinarians, but they can help farms, these smaller farms, to find solutions to improve. But part of it also is to get them to learn the fact that it's in their own interest. Like, they may not be motivated at first, but we can show them data. Okay, you want to do things your way, but this is your higher risk here. Okay, don't complain if something happens. So I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, that's the thing. We're all in this together, right? We want them to succeed. We're not enemies here. We just want to make sure that it doesn't result in a disaster in the industry as a result. So, yeah. So, I mean, we've been having a great conversation. I wish we could go longer, but I think we might have to have a second episode if we wanted to do longer. So, I mean, before I get to our final three questions, though, I will just ask if there's one kind of take-home message that you want the listeners to get from today's episode. What would that be?
Well, the take-home message is that biosecurity is a people's game, is a people issue, and so they need to focus on that. They can have a biosecurity plan on paper, but is it actually applied correctly on the farm? So they need to have a critical look at their farm, their situation, to say, am I set up properly? Is it easy to change boots, for example, in the entry room? If it's complicated, well, people won't. So have a look at that. It's a human issue by and large.
Yeah, I think great message, and hopefully people take that and go back and look at what they're doing and evaluate to make sure they're doing it right and doing it and actually doing it. So
it's time for our famous three. Working with nature and not against it, piglets fed AX3 see significant and improved feed efficiency. Producers know the reality of needing to reduce antibiotic and zinc use. AX3 Digest is a highly digestible novel protein that promotes improved in-barn performance, piglet health, and minimizes the need for zinc in the diet. For more information, visit www.protecta.com. That's www.protecta.com.
So at the end of every episode, we ask everybody the same three questions, just a little bit related but unrelated to the topic. The first being, what would be your favorite go-to swine or agricultural related resource?
Well, if you're looking at swine, I'll go with Disease of Swine, the health swine disease Bible. I tell you why. First of all, it's got a great track record. They always come up with a new edition every 4 or 5 years. But the main thing is, if I have a problem, I will find the essentials in there, including the name of who wrote the chapter, and or the including the co-authors. Because one thing I do, the books that I appreciate the most are the books where I can figure out who is the right person, so that I can contact that person. Nowadays, with social media, the emails and all that, it's fairly easy. And remarkably, even people you don't know, if you contact them and you say, "Hey, I've got this issue," they'll reply. So in my case, I can understand that for a swine grower that would not be Disease of Swine, but I'll go with Disease of Swine.
No, it's a good one. Obviously important. I like your idea of knowing who wrote it so that you know who to go to. So our next question is, outside of agriculture, then, what is your favorite book or resource?
Well, I've got a few, but in terms of a resource for my field, or it can be anything, right? I found a book recently that has to do with, it's a French title, but it's about the Pope's animals. The In the Vatican, the Vatican is technically something that's several hundred years old. And it's just not where the Pope is, or the Catholic Church is as the leadership. The Vatican per se historically was a place where it was like Michael Jackson's place. You could have an elephant there, you had giraffes, you had all sorts of animals, and they had a lot of animals given to them by leaders of kingdoms, of tribes, going back centuries, and they documented that, and it's remarkable what they learned, because they in the Vatican, as I said, you had like scientists, you had and you look at how they manage these animals and the symbols associated with these animals. If it's really something that is a mix of learning history and learning about animals, learning about the relationship between animals and humans, or how also uh, animals are perceived by humans because of all the symbols that are attributed to different species. So I haven't finished reading this, but it's quite interesting.
It sounds fascinating. I have to look that one up. Assuming it's available in English, not just in French.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so our final question is: when you look back and you, or even now, and you think about like a successful swine professional or a leader, what is a characteristic that you think that sets them apart from somebody that might not be as successful?
The first characteristic, they always want to learn. They're never satisfied with what they've got. They always try to improve systematically. That's a lifelong thing. The other characteristic that I find in leaders and winners and all that is their understanding of their field goes way beyond their field. Like I was giving the example of Bob Morrison. Um, Bob had training as an epidemiologist. He could do biostatistics, analyze data, and all that. But he had an intimate knowledge of the field, understood what was behind the data, including the value of the data, and he went beyond that to get training, like as I mentioned, his MBA, so that he could relate better to the individuals he was working with, and address the issue of, oh, well, if we do this, because sometimes Al Lehman would say that the doing nothing, the decision of doing nothing is a decision, and because sometimes that's the best thing you can do. But you cannot just say that, by just guessing. You need to back it up with data. And so those leaders who have, I'll give you another example. I have Eric Gonder, who just retired. He was with Goldsboro Milling, and he was kind of the chief vet on the turkey and swine side. And this guy even learned how to schedule the placement of flocks, for example, in turkeys, or sending them to the slaughter plants and all that. And I thought, well, he was very far from veterinary medicine, but he told me, he said, I got to learn everything that had to do with the production of turkeys and swine, and so I was invited to the decision table. You see, if you stay strictly in your field, extremely narrow field, yeah, we may ask your opinion, but you're not going to be a decision maker.
Yeah, it reminds when you go back and you were talking about the thing of like of somebody coming and telling you, well, you should implement this, but they have no understanding of how that actually gets implemented or what impact that's going to be, right? So clearly understanding more than just your area.
That's it. And understanding the ins and outs. I remember I wanted to learn English many years ago. I was a late teenager, and I really figured I needed to learn English to get around. And so I went to work for hybrid turkeys. And one day they told me, they say, today you're just going to have to vaccinate 300 reproductive males. We call them toms. And once you've done that, hey, the day is yours. I thought, okay, I'll be done like maximum an hour. I mean, 300 birds, what can it be? Well, these were big birds. They did not appreciate getting stabbed. And a few hours later, by the time I was done, my arms were blue. I'd been hit because they have wings and they and their claws and the whole thing. Boy, now I know if I ask an employee to do something like that, I know what he's getting into, and I think that's important because then if I tell him, well, you're going to have to do this, and I realize that may take you 4 hours, and you'll be sick and tired, then he realizes he knows what I'm, and that helps because if they know that you're aware of what you're asking, then it's a little bit more difficult to say, you don't know what you're talking about, because you show that. That's part of good leadership as well.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. Well, we're coming up to the hour, so it's one of the longest podcasts I think we've had, but that's good. It's been a great conversation, a lot of good information. So I hope you enjoyed being on it, and I'll thank you again for coming on, and definitely I think we'll have you on in the future. I'd be really interested to know about the project that you're working on when you start to get some more results. So looking forward to that. So thank you, and thank everyone for listening.